In this episode, we're going to take the privacy program out of the abstract and put it into motion because the difference between a program that looks good on paper and a program that works is the operating model. A privacy operating model is the practical system that says who does what, when they do it, how work moves between teams, and how leadership can see whether privacy is being managed consistently. The Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, exam cares about this because many organizations have policies and even a charter, but they still fail in predictable ways, like privacy reviews happening too late, rights requests turning into chaos, vendors being on board without oversight, and incidents becoming communication disasters. Those failures usually trace back to an operating model that is unclear, overly centralized, or dependent on informal relationships. Our goal is to build an operating model with responsibilities and reporting that actually work in real life, meaning it survives busy weeks, staff turnover, competing priorities, and rapid business change. By the end, you should be able to explain what an operating model is, how it connects to governance and maturity, and what makes responsibilities and reporting usable rather than decorative. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An operating model is the daily blueprint for how a privacy program runs, and it sits between governance and operations in a way that is easy to miss. Governance defines decision rights and accountability at a high level, while the operating model defines the workflows, handoffs, and routines that turn those decision rights into repeatable behavior. If governance says certain processing activities require review, the operating model defines how a team submits a request, what information is required, who reviews it, what the turnaround expectations are, and what happens when there is disagreement. If governance says rights requests must be honored, the operating model defines how requests are received, how identity is verified, who gathers data, who approves responses, and how deadlines are tracked. If the charter says privacy will be measurable, the operating model defines what gets measured, how data is collected, who reviews it, and how corrective actions are assigned. A beginner mistake is to treat the operating model as a diagram or a document, but in practice it is a set of habits and workflows that people follow without constant negotiation. When the operating model is strong, privacy becomes part of normal business flow. When it is weak, privacy becomes a series of emergencies and arguments. The first building block of an operating model that works is clear responsibility design that matches how work actually happens, not how people wish work happened. Responsibility means who performs a task, but in privacy, tasks often require multiple roles, so you need clarity about owners, contributors, and approvers. The owner is accountable for outcomes and is responsible for making sure the task gets done even when obstacles appear. Contributors provide information or perform parts of the work, such as data owners gathering records or security teams providing incident details. Approvers make binding decisions, such as whether residual risk is acceptable or whether an exception is granted. In a mature model, these roles are clear enough that people do not argue about ownership every time, because arguments waste time and create bypassing. Responsibility design should also account for capacity, because assigning responsibilities without time and resourcing turns the model into fiction. A privacy program manager should be able to look at a workflow and say, this role owns it, these roles support it, and this is how it moves through the system. That is what it means for responsibilities to actually work. Because privacy work is cross-functional, an operating model must also define interfaces between teams, and these interfaces are where friction usually lives. Interfaces exist between privacy and legal for interpreting obligations and reviewing high-impact decisions. Interfaces exist between privacy and security for access control expectations, incident coordination, and investigation support. Interfaces exist between privacy and procurement for vendor onboarding, contract terms, and ongoing oversight. Interfaces exist between privacy and product teams for integrating privacy review into design and change processes. Interfaces exist between privacy and customer support for rights requests, complaint handling, and communication consistency. Without clear interfaces, tasks fall into gaps, or teams duplicate work, or privacy is pulled in too late and then blamed for delays. A working operating model defines what information each interface needs, what triggers engagement, and what the handoff looks like when one team finishes and another begins. It also defines escalation paths when interfaces stall, because stalled interfaces create missed obligations. The exam often tests interface failures indirectly by describing a breakdown and asking what should be changed, and strengthening the operating model is often the correct answer. A practical operating model also needs a work intake mechanism, because privacy cannot manage what it cannot see, and many privacy failures begin as invisible processing. Work intake is the controlled way teams bring new processing activities, new vendors, new data uses, and major changes into the privacy program early enough for review. Intake should be simple enough that teams will actually use it and structured enough that privacy can triage requests based on risk. Risk-based triage matters because not every activity deserves the same level of review, and over-review creates bottlenecks that encourage bypassing. A strong intake process asks for the key facts needed for decision-making, such as purpose, data categories, affected populations, sharing practices, retention expectations, and whether automation or profiling is involved. It then routes higher-risk items to deeper assessment, potentially including a data protection impact assessment, DPIA, where appropriate, while lower-risk items follow a lighter path. The operating model should also define service expectations for intake, such as response time targets and clear outcomes, because teams need predictability. When intake is missing or slow, privacy becomes reactive and trust inside the organization erodes. Rights request handling is one of the clearest tests of whether an operating model works, because it requires coordination, deadlines, verification, and documentation under pressure. A working model defines who receives requests, how they are logged, how identity is verified, and how requests are categorized so the right workflow is triggered. It defines who owns data retrieval across systems, which is often distributed because different teams own different databases and tools. It defines who reviews responses for completeness and compliance, because partial or inconsistent responses create complaint risk and regulatory attention. It also defines how extensions, denials, or partial fulfillments are handled when allowed, and how explanations are communicated in a consistent tone. Even if you do not memorize every legal timeline, you should understand that deadlines require tracking and escalation, because missed deadlines are a common noncompliance trigger. The operating model should include reporting on rights request volume, response timeliness, and recurring pain points, because those metrics reveal where the system needs improvement. When a scenario describes chaotic rights handling, the answer is rarely to tell people to work harder. The answer is to improve intake, routing, ownership, and tracking. That is operating model thinking. Vendor and partner oversight is another area where operating models often fail, because responsibility is split across privacy, procurement, security, and legal, and without a model, each group assumes the others are handling it. A working operating model defines how vendors are classified by risk, how privacy reviews are triggered, and what evidence is required before a vendor can process personal information. It defines how contract terms are reviewed and approved, including data use limitations, retention expectations, breach notification duties, and support for rights requests. It defines how vendor onboarding is documented and where approvals are recorded, because missing records make oversight impossible to demonstrate. It also defines ongoing monitoring, such as periodic reassessment, review of subprocessor changes, and incident communication expectations. This is especially important in cross-border contexts, because vendor processing locations and subcontractors can create territorial scope issues. A mature model prevents last-minute vendor surprises by integrating privacy steps into procurement workflows, so the business does not treat privacy as an optional delay. Exam questions about third parties often reward answers that add structure, routing, and reporting rather than relying on informal agreements. Vendors are part of the privacy system, and the operating model must treat them that way. Incident coordination is a third area where operating models are either strong or fragile, because incidents demand speed, clarity, and consistent communication. A working model defines how incidents are detected and escalated to the right teams, including security for investigation and containment and privacy for evaluation of obligations and communication needs. It defines who is responsible for assessing whether personal information was involved, what populations are affected, and what the potential harm looks like, because those factors influence notification decisions. It defines who drafts communications, who approves them, and how timelines are tracked, because delays and inconsistent messaging increase trust damage and enforcement risk. It also defines a post-incident review process that turns lessons learned into program improvements, such as updating procedures, tightening access controls, or improving training. A beginner mistake is to think incident response is a security-only function, but privacy program management requires coordinated response because obligations often involve transparency and accountability. When the operating model is weak, incidents become chaotic and stressful, and that stress increases the chance of mistakes. When the operating model is strong, the organization responds with discipline, and discipline limits harm. A privacy operating model also needs a training and awareness mechanism that is connected to real responsibilities rather than being a generic yearly event. A working model defines who is required to take training, what role-based training exists for high-impact roles, and how completion is tracked and escalated. It also defines how training content stays current, because privacy risks and practices evolve, especially when new technologies and new data uses appear. Training should be tied to procedures people actually follow, such as how to handle a rights request, how to onboard a vendor, or how to escalate a privacy concern during product design. When training is disconnected from daily work, it becomes background noise and does not change behavior. The operating model should also include a way for employees to ask questions and report concerns, because early reporting prevents larger failures. That might involve a privacy help channel, office hours, or embedded privacy leads, but the model must define how requests are handled and how patterns are identified. The exam often favors answers that build practical training and communication loops, because those loops are how culture becomes operational. Training is not a substitute for governance, but it is a vital part of making governance executable. Reporting is where an operating model becomes visible, and visibility is what allows leadership to manage privacy rather than merely hope for the best. Reporting does not mean producing long documents. It means providing decision-makers with clear signals about whether the program is functioning and where risk is increasing. A working model defines what gets reported, how often, to whom, and what actions are expected in response. Reporting often includes operational metrics like rights request volume and timeliness, assessment completion rates, vendor review coverage, training completion, incident trends, and exception counts. It also includes risk signals like recurring policy violations, repeated processing surprises, or rising complaint levels. The goal is not to create metrics for their own sake, but to create an early warning system that supports resource allocation and process improvement. Reporting must also respect the audience, because executives need trend and risk posture summaries, while operational teams need actionable insights and clear ownership for corrective actions. If reporting is too detailed for leadership, it gets ignored. If it is too vague for operational teams, it is useless. A privacy program manager designs reporting to drive decisions, not to decorate slides. A reliable operating model also includes review cadence, because without regular review, privacy becomes reactive and drift accumulates quietly. Review cadence means there are scheduled moments where the program examines metrics, reviews high-risk processing changes, evaluates exceptions, and updates policies and procedures based on what is actually happening. This is where the privacy life cycle becomes continuous improvement rather than a one-time build. For example, if assessment metrics show teams are bypassing intake, the program can adjust the intake process, clarify accountability, and strengthen stakeholder alignment. If rights request metrics show delays due to certain systems, the program can prioritize improving data retrieval or retention rules for those systems. If vendor oversight shows recurring contract issues, the program can update templates and procurement workflows. Review cadence also supports maturity growth, because as the program stabilizes, it can expand from basic compliance into more refined governance, such as more nuanced risk tiering and deeper integration into product development. The exam often expects you to understand that operating models require ongoing management, not a set-and-forget approach. A program that reviews and improves itself is more resilient under change. It's also important to recognize what makes responsibilities and reporting fail, because many organizations accidentally build operating models that look structured but collapse under pressure. Responsibilities fail when they are assigned without authority, meaning people are expected to enforce privacy without decision rights or support. They fail when roles are unclear, causing teams to argue or to assume someone else will act. They fail when the model is too centralized, creating bottlenecks that encourage bypassing, or too decentralized, creating inconsistency and uneven adoption. Reporting fails when metrics are not tied to decisions, when data is unreliable, or when leaders do not act on signals, which teaches teams that the program is performative. Reporting also fails when it is used to blame individuals rather than improve systems, because that creates fear and discourages early reporting. A mature operating model anticipates these failure modes and designs around them by clarifying ownership, building routing and escalation, and using metrics as feedback rather than as punishment. Exam scenarios about recurring privacy problems often trace back to these operating model weaknesses. When you learn to spot them, you can answer questions with program-shaped fixes. To make this exam ready, it helps to translate operating model thinking into the types of choices you make when you read a scenario. If you see repeated privacy issues, you should think about whether the operating model includes intake, triage, and tracking, because repeated issues often mean work is invisible and unmanaged. If you see delays and frustration, you should think about whether responsibilities and interfaces are clear, because delays often mean handoffs are undefined or bottlenecks exist. If you see inconsistent decisions across business units, you should think about whether reporting and governance review cadence exist, because inconsistency often means no one is monitoring and enforcing standards. If you see surprise vendor issues, you should think about procurement integration and ongoing oversight, because surprises happen when vendor workflows bypass privacy review. If you see rights request chaos, you should think about routing, data owner responsibilities, and deadline tracking, because those are the mechanisms that make rights handling reliable. The exam is often looking for whether you choose systemic improvements over one-time fixes, and operating model improvements are systemic by definition. When you reason this way, your answers become more consistent and less dependent on guessing. As we close, remember that an operating model is the practical engine of the privacy program, translating governance and strategy into repeatable work that survives real-life pressure. Responsibilities work when ownership, contribution, and approval are clear, when authority matches accountability, and when interfaces between teams are defined so handoffs do not break. Intake and triage make privacy proactive by making new processing visible early and routing work based on risk, rather than reacting after harm occurs. Rights request handling, vendor oversight, incident coordination, and training are core program capabilities that succeed only when workflows, tracking, and escalation are designed intentionally. Reporting makes the program manageable by giving leaders and teams clear signals, and review cadence turns those signals into continuous improvement rather than stale dashboards. A working operating model avoids dependence on informal relationships by embedding privacy into business processes through predictable routines and measurable outcomes. When you can explain how to build an operating model that actually works, you are demonstrating the practical, systems-focused thinking that CIPM is designed to measure, because privacy success is not a single decision, but a reliable way of operating every day.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.